I'm Cleve Bourbon. I just kind of wanted to come on here and talk to you a little bit about self-editing your novel. So, a couple of things that I wanted to bring up first. One, if you're not subscribed, I do give grammar lessons and things like that on this channel. Please, you can subscribe down below. You know what to do. Secondly, this is new software for me, so you'll have to bear with me when I'm working on this a little bit. If I'd have thought, I would have made a possibility for you to download the notes I'm about to follow, but instead of doing that, I forgot. So I'm going to go ahead and put them on screen so that you can see them while I talk. A little bit about me. You can see kind of behind me over here. I do write fantasy predominantly. My series is Tournament of Mages is my main series, but I also have a couple of others, and they're easy to find. You can just Google Cleve Bourbon. You can find them very easily. So anyway, let's get to the topic at hand. Okay, I do have two monitors, so if you see me looking this way, it's because I'm actually looking at the chat and stuff over there. So just bear with me on that if I do that. All right, so I'm going to see if I can go ahead and share my screen here. And again, this is new software, so that is not what I wanted to share. Okay, let me try that again. All right, share screen, and let's see if I can do this. Okay, that is not it either. All right, so let's try this one more time. All right. If not, then I'll just go ahead and move on. But let me see if I can do it this way. Okay. Nope. Hang on. Maybe this way. No. Okay. Anyway, I'll just go ahead and do it that way. I'm not sure exactly how to share the screen so that I can be with you. So I'll just go ahead and talk about it. So first of all, there's a couple of reasons why you might want to self-edit, and those are because you're getting your manuscript ready for to send out to an editor, or you might be, fairly new and not really have ability to send to pay for an editor yet. So you're doing some self-editing to present your novel or publish your novel without an editor. So there's a couple of reasons for that. There's a third reason, and that reason would be if you're just kind of self-editing to send to to beta readers, which you should do before you send to a professional editor anyway. But I hate to tell you this, but the editing process is not a quick process at all. No matter how you slice it up, it's kind of like that. Sorry, I keep moving myself around here. But there are some ways that you can get around to where you can make it a little bit easier on yourself. All right. And okay, I'm sorry, I keep moving myself around. Like I said, this is new software to me. So, all right. So the first thing that you should think about when you're self-editing is using editing software. Now, I know a lot of people use editing software, and the thoughts on editing software is, there's like Grammarly and ProWriting Aid and so forth. These are the AI editors. These are good editors to use. However, they don't catch everything, and sometimes, depending on what you're writing, they might not quite get what you want exactly correct. So it's probably a good idea that you know some basic grammar rules so that you can use those as a tool to edit your work first, like right after you get finished with the rough draft, and then you can self-edit afterwards or fix the mistakes that it couldn't quite fix. You should probably use your editing software for your first round of edits. In other words, right after your rough draft. Secondly, running your book through editing software usually, like I said, is not enough to send to the book to the pro editor afterward, because there are some issues that can crop up with the AI editors. And I'm not knocking them; they're good. There's several of them out there. I just brought up the two most prominent, which is probably Grammarly and ProWriting Aid, but there's others. There's Hemingway, and there's several others. But anyway, so a little bit about me. I have a master's degree in English and a bachelor's degree in English, of course. And I teach grammar classes in school. I teach online. And so one of the things I do teach is creative writing. And when I'm teaching creative writing, I always teach the students the writing process. And it's very important to understand the writing process. The first thing to do is to write the novel or write the story, write the draft the novel, right? That's the first thing you do. When you're doing that, you shouldn't necessarily try to edit or do too much editing while you're writing it. You should just get the story out. That's the primary goal of the writing process. After you get the entire story or novel written, then you should go and start with the revise and edit phase. That's the next step in the writing process. Now, this stage requires, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here in just a moment, but this stage requires a lot of, you can take out paragraphs, maybe get rid of a character, add another character in, um, move around sentences, change up chapters, whatever you need to do. The revise and edit stage is where you rip apart your draft and really do some work on it. Once you get finished with that part of the writing process, you end up with a second draft. The second draft is the one that you should proofread, because that's going to become your third draft, and hopefully that's your final draft. Now, when you proofread, you're looking at the little minute details, punctuation, spelling errors, and things along those lines. And once you get that part done, then the proofreading done, then you should have your third draft. And there is, if you need to repeat the second step and go back and revise and edit again after you've proofread, that's a possibility. And then you might have to, you just repeat. So anyway, the process is draft the novel, revise and edit. You get the second draft, you take the second draft, you proofread, or you revise and edit again if you need to. And then you end up with your third draft. And your third draft, you either publish or you proofread again and then publish, depending on how many times you need to, you feel comfortable with your manuscript. I know famously in fantasy, which is what I write, Brandon Sanderson, when he did the final Wheel of Time series, which was started by another author named Robert Jordan, when he was finishing that, he talked about how he had to revise and edit that book many, many times before he got to the final draft. He still had to follow the writing process, draft the novel, revise and edit, get the second draft, proofread the second draft, get the third draft, revise and edit that, then proofread that, then get another draft, and so forth. So it just kind of goes on until you're done with the novel. So the first, I said I'd go into more detail about the writing process. The first thing you should do is not worry about editing when you're writing the novel. You should write the novel and get it out. The reason why is because you have a creative side, which is your right side of your brain. And you have your left side of your brain, which is your analytical side. So when you're creating and then you're trying to edit, you're actually fighting against yourself. You're actually working against trying to create your novel, or your story. So you should get the whole novel out first and then go back and edit afterwards. It makes the process a lot easier, a lot better, and it's a lot less painful. All right, so once you have the first draft, you don't need to worry if it's a train wreck of a terrible grammar and punctuation, like if it's a whole conglomeration of stuff like that, because you can always go back and fix things. Once it's published, you can't fix anything. You're just kind of stuck with it, right? So if the left brain right versus the right brain, that's a thing. So that's why you shouldn't. What happens? Okay, I'll go into a little bit more detail about that. So what happens is when your right brain is in creation mode and your left brain is in edit mode, and you're trying to do it at the same time, what happens is you'll end up fixating on like a chapter or a sentence or a paragraph, and you'll just keep rewriting it, reworking it, and you'll get stuck, and eventually you'll get tired and fatigued, and then that's what causes people to abandon stories and novels. They finally get to the point where they just give up on it. So it's not a good thing to try to work against yourself, and that's usually what happens. That's one of the main reasons why people don't finish their manuscripts a lot of times. All right, so back to the editing part, self-editing. When you do have a novel length work, you should edit it in chunks, meaning that depending on what kind of chunks you're talking about, it could be paragraphs or it could be, I would suggest if it's a novel length, it's chapters. you edit chapter by chapter. If you do that a little at a time, take it one step at a time, the editing process goes by a lot faster than if you try to do the whole thing at once. You'll burn yourself out. Also, if it's a short story, then I do it by paragraph by paragraph. Okay. So after you edit it in chunks, it might seem like it's going kind of slow, but you are making progression. What you want to feel when you're editing is you want to feel like you're making progression. You don't want to feel like you're stuck on something. So you've got to reach a point when you're editing like a chapter or a paragraph to be able to move on from that, to go, okay, that's good enough for now, and move on. I'm going to talk a little bit more later on about color coding when you come into a rough spot in your manuscript. You can color code that. You can mark it. You can have a color code. I've got several. I'll show you what I've got. I've got several of these little stickers that I can put in my novel. They're little tags that I put in. They're different colors. They mean different things, and that way I can go back to that page if I have it printed out. If you have it on the computer, you can still color code. And, there's you can highlight in different colors. Anyway, the process of coloring the rough spots is so that you can go ahead and move on and come back to it later. Like if you have to look up something, like you're not sure about a comma usage or something like that, and you can come back to it later instead of bogging down and focusing on that one thing and never getting past it. That way you feel like there's progression. You can get to the end of the manuscript, and then you can go back and look at the harder stuff one by one, and you can take it a little bit better because you feel like there's progress happening. All right, so in order to edit, you should familiarize yourself with basic grammar rules and punctuation. I'm going to go over a few of those, the big ones, here in just a moment. There's a lot of grammar books out there, and I have one that I've written. I actually have a workbook for adults. You can find it by Googling Cleve Bourbon or looking at my Amazon page. It's on there. And there's other, you don't have to use mine, of course. There's lots of grammar books out there that tells you how to punctuate and things like that. If you're really serious about self-editing. So even if and I'm going to talk about this in a moment too. I actually talked to a professional editor and I asked her what the most common mistakes were made on manuscripts. I'm going to get to that here in just a moment. So, you should self-edit even if you're planning on sending it to an editor, because if you just do your first draft, your rough train wreck draft, you send that to the editor, you're going to, and okay, this is what usually happens. According to this editor person that I know, she said that what happens is people will send the first draft and then they'll say, "You think you can have that done in about a week?" And she's like, "I have a family. It's going to take me forever to get through this rough draft." So you should self-edit. Send it to beta readers, get their feedback, and then send it to a pro editor if you're planning on using a pro editor. And I'm going to talk more about that here in just a moment on why you should do that. All right. So point 3 on self-editing was edit in chunks. Point 4 is familiarize yourself with basic grammar. Point 5, follow a professional editing process, professional editor process, I should say. And that professional editor process is basically the writing process that I talked about a little bit earlier, but I'm going to go over it in a little more detail. All right, so first of all, the first thing that a professional editor might look at is your developmental edits. Developmental edits is where you go through your manuscript and try to get rid of all the plot holes if there are any, or try to find if you need any plot hole. If you need to fix any or plug any plot holes. If a character doesn't make sense, or if you talk about a character at the beginning of the story who is supposed to be very stubborn and doesn't want to do things, but then they agree to everything later on, and okay, I'll do that. Sure, I'll do that. That's not being very stubborn. So, things like that, developmental. In the writing process, that is what you're doing when you draft the novel and you start doing the revising and edit stage, where you start tearing apart your manuscript and really looking for the minute details. The second thing that an editor will do is the line edit. So if you're self-editing, you're going to be doing this, the line edit. This is when you revise and edit and you add a character, take out a character, get rid of a paragraph. One of the things that I see in creative writing a lot when I teach creative writing is people are so scared to take chapters out of their books or take things out of their story that doesn't work It's like I spent, hours writing that. I don't want to get rid of that part. Get rid of that part. It's called kill your darlings. If I know it was a great piece of prose, you think, save it for something else. If it's not working in that novel, get rid of it. You got to be able to let go sometimes. It's hard. It's very hard. What I do personally is if I see something that doesn't work, I just copy and paste that somewhere, and I'll use that in something else or something, especially if it's something that I really liked, but it doesn't quite work in the novel that I'm writing. All right. So once you revise and edit, you'll once again check to make sure you don't have new plot holes, because what happens a lot of times is when you get to the second draft, you've taken apart stuff and you've thrown out this paragraph and you add a new character and all that. And guess what? You created yourself a whole brand new plot hole you didn't even know about. So you got to go back and I know this is a tedious process, but you've got to go back and reread the novel to make sure you didn't create new plot holes. You got rid of the old ones. You might have created some new ones, and it does happen. I can guarantee it does happen. All right. Then when you get that draft finished, that you proofread again. That's what an editor would, professional editor would do. They'll proofread again. That's where they're really nitpicky. They fix things like punctuation, word choice, style issues. And this can be repeated several times if you need to. All right. And then finally, before you're ready to publish and you're self-editing and sending the manuscript to a professional editor, this final step is absolutely crucial. If you do nothing else with your manuscript, if you don't follow the other things I mentioned, you do this thing no matter what. And that is have your computer read your manuscript back to you. Okay? And the reason why I say this is because remember when I was talking about your brain working against yourself? When you're creating on one side, on your right side, and you're editing with your left side, you're fighting yourself. Well, one thing that your brain likes to do is it likes to try to help you. So when you're writing your manuscript, your brain will say, okay, you wrote this. And so when you're going back and you're reading it in your head, you're reading it the way you thought you wrote it, not the way you actually wrote it. And what I mean by that is you might have left out articles like a and the, and you don't even know it, because when you read it, you read those back in there because your brain says, hey, you wrote that way. Sometimes you'll have a word like you wrote your word processor, if you're using like Word or something, or some other writing program, Scrivener or whatever, you might have written a word that you meant to be a word like indicate, and you actually wrote initiate, because when you might have misspelled it a little bit and your spell checker caught it and put in initiate instead of indicate. So when you go back and you read that, I would like to indicate this, and that's what you thought you wrote, and you actually wrote, I would like to initiate this. And see, you're going to read it as indicate, but it's actually initiate. Well, when you have it read back to you by the computer doesn't do that. It sees initiate, and it's going to say it, and it's going to stand out like a German Shepherd and a pack of Chihuahuas. It's just going to pop right at you. So always have your computer read back to you. Now, I know it's a robotic voice, and Word sounds really terrible, no matter if you use the female or the male voice, but there are other programs. There's a Natural Reader out there. I think there's a free version and a subscription model. I'm not really sure anymore because I don't use it. Or if you're going to do, like, if you eventually when KDP, Amazon gets their program where they're doing their audiobook but fixed a little bit better, you can actually go through and check your manuscript that way. Just use if you're making an audiobook out of it, you can listen to it back when you're changing stuff on there, and you'll hear it back to yourself. But if you don't have it read back to yourself, you're not going to catch a lot of stuff self-editing that maybe a pro editor would. Okay, so that's a crucial step. Always have it read back to you. All right, and I'll look at the chat here in just a moment, and I'll take any questions. If you have any questions, just put a big Q in front of it. That way I'll know that that's a question. All right, so I'm going to go over some common punctuation errors. Now, this comes from my creative writing class. It also comes from being an English teacher for, I don't know how many years, 20 years. All right, so the number one error that I see usually is comma usage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about comma usage, where to put your commas. All right, so I wish I could share my screen, but I'm terrible at sharing screens on this software. But anyway, So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. First of all, a phrase and a clause, the difference between a phrase and a clause. A clause has both a subject and a verb in it. It would be like, I'm going to the store. It's a regular sentence. A phrase is a group of words that does not have both a subject and a verb. So a phrase would be like around the corner or over the hill. It's just a phrase. There's also a dependent clause, which usually has a subordinating conjunction. What that means is it's a clause that has both a subject and a verb in it, but it has a word at the beginning of the dependent clause that makes it where it can't stand alone as a sentence. In other words, it'd be because I lied, it can't stand on its own as a sentence. If you say I lied, that's a sentence, right? Because I is the subject and lied is the verb. But if you say because I lied, then it's no longer a complete sentence. It's a dependent clause because you lied, what happens? We don't know. That's a dependent clause. That's called a subordinating conjunction. So what you would have to do is you'd have to put a main clause with that for it to make sense. Because I lied, I had to apologize. See, and then it becomes a complete sentence again. You need three things to have a complete sentence: a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. When you use a dependent clause, you get rid of the complete thought because it doesn't make sense on its own. All right. So when you have a dependent clause beginning your sentence, you always put a comma after it. So because I lied, comma, I had to apologize. But it doesn't have a comma if you move the main clause first. In other words, if you say, I had to apologize because I lied, there's no comma in that sentence. All right? That's where people make mistakes. They want to put the comma in there. The comma is only if it opens a sentence. Same thing with phrases. If a prepositional phrase opens a sentence, like over the mountains we traveled, over the mountains is a prepositional phrase. If it's 3 words or fewer, you really don't need a comma. But if I said over the Rocky Mountains we traveled, you would have a comma after mountains. But if you reversed it, we traveled over the Rocky Mountains, there is no comma. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense to everybody. All right. So if you have 2 prepositional phrases at the beginning of a sentence, you always put a comma after the second prepositional phrase. For example, if you say, at the end of a long day, we like to rest by the fire. Okay, at the end of a long day, there's 2 prepositional phrases, at the end and of a long day. So you put a comma after the second one. All right, so if you have a prepositional phrase that's 3 words and it opens a sentence, if you put a comma after it, that's fine. The rule is you don't need one. Like if you say, over the mountains we traveled, technically you don't need one in that sentence. But if you put over the mountains, comma, we traveled, no one's going to, there is no preposition police that's going to say, hey, it's okay. You don't need one if it's 3 words or fewer and it opens a sentence. But if you might be seeing a pattern here. I'm talking about if these phrases or dependent clauses open a sentence, but if they're at the end of the sentence, there's usually not a comma. So you should be seeing a pattern. So there's a couple other phrases that we have in the English language. We have a participial phrase. You're like, oh, here we go. Participial. What's that? What's a participle? Well, a participle is a word that looks like a verb but acts like an adjective. For example, if you're retiling your bathroom and you're retiling it with shattered tiles is a participle. Shattered is a participle because you're not shattering the tiles. You're not using it as a verb. You're using it as a word to describe the tiles. Shattered tiles, right? All right. Comma saves lives. Yes, they do. All right. So shattered tiles. Another thing is like running water. Running water. Running is modifying water, which is, adjectives modify nouns or pronouns. So running water, that's a participle. So a participial phrase would be like running through the wet grass, comma, John was worried he would stain the bottom of his pants green. All right, so running through the grass, comma, running through the grass is a participial phrase. But if you said John was worried he would stain the bottom of his pants while running through the grass, or John was worried about he would stain the bottom of his pants green running through the grass, you would not have a comma. Now, if you put one there, no one's going to, that's another place with a participle. If you have the participle at the end of the sentence, you can put a comma there. It's not absolutely, imperative that you don't, but you don't have to. But you do have to if it begins the sentence. Another place where you put commas is what's called an appositive. If you don't know what an appositive is a word right next to a noun that redescribes that noun in some way. So if you have like John, my next door neighbor, is a nice guy. Okay, my next door neighbor is an appositive. It's telling you about John, right? John, my next door neighbor. All right. Here's the deal with appositives. If the information in the appositive is essential to the meaning of the sentence, you put commas. I'm sorry. If it's essential, you don't put commas. If it's non-essential, like John, my next door neighbor, is a nice guy. So you could just say John is a nice guy. And so my next door neighbor is not needed. It's non-essential. So you do put commas around that. If it's essential to the meaning, you don't put commas. It sounds backwards. So if you need the information in the positive, you don't put commas. And if you don't need the information, you do put commas. I know it sounds backwards, but so I'll give you another example of a positive. Most of the time when people get married, they only marry one person usually. So if they're talking about their wife or their husband, it's probably going to be the one they married. So if John's wife is named Sylvia and he says, my wife Sylvia is going to come to the party with me. All right. We know that Sylvia is his wife. So that's non-essential information. You put commas, right? If John is talking about his sisters and he says, my sister Jill has 3 children and he has 3 sisters, then that's essential information. There would be no commas around Jill because we have to tell which sister he's talking about when he says that she has 3 children. So if John said John's sister has 3 children, and we know that John has 3 sisters, we've got which sister are you talking about? So John's sister Jill has 3 children. There would be no commas around Jill. I hope that makes sense to everybody. All right. And the last one I want to talk about with commas is infinitive phrases. An infinitive is the word to plus a verb, and you're not supposed to put anything between to and the verb. It's called split infinitive. Like Star Trek, when they go space, the final frontier, and it goes to boldly go where no one has gone before. To boldly go is a split infinitive, and it's been around since 1966, so it's probably okay. But it should have been to go boldly where no one has gone before. But splitting hairs there. All right. Anyway, an infinitive phrase is to plus a verb. So in a phrase, it would be to run in the marathon, comma, you must first register with the organizers. So to run in the marathon is an infinitive phrase. You put a comma. If you said you must first register with the organizers to run in the marathon, there would be no comma in that sentence. So once again, phrases at the beginning of the sentence, you put a comma. If it's at the end, don't worry about putting a comma. So hopefully that will help you with commas. So back to what I was saying earlier about color coding. If you come across something that you don't know and you have to look it up, and when you're self-editing, you should have a color code of some kind, green, red, blue, whatever you want to do that you understand, that you recognize, so that when you have an issue, you can mark it and you can move on, so that you get through your whole manuscript and you can go back and fix the harder stuff later. And that's just so that you can feel like you're still progressing, because if you stop and fixate on one thing, all of your work halts when you do that. So it's a good idea when you come across something you don't know to color code and come back to it later. That's my tip on that. Okay, so I asked a professional editor what she corrected most in manuscripts. All right, and here's what she said. She said, number 1, dialogue is easily number 1. The punctuation surrounding it. An action beat versus a dialogue tag, using too many dialogue tags. Repetitive sentences around dialogue. And she gave me an example. Daniel, I said his name, which that's to me, that's odd. I would never write that. Using new paragraphs for dialogue. And what she means by that is every time a person speaks in your writing, you should start a new paragraph, no matter if it's like one after the other. A new paragraph is for every person that starts speaking. Every new person that's speaking should have another paragraph. You shouldn't have all of it in the middle of paragraphs, unless it's the same person speaking. All right. Now, as far as the punctuation with dialogue, I myself have trouble with that. So I keep a little self-editing notebook, and I have a sheet in here, a cheat sheet that I have all of my, I don't know if you can see it or not. I have all of the dialogue stuff in here. So I actually have trouble. For some reason, I can't remember how to punctuate dialogue. I've never been able to remember it. So I don't know. I can't remember where I got the cheat sheet from. It might have been from my editor, but I keep one because I myself cannot remember that. So that might be something that if you don't remember, you have to keep a cheat sheet for. I definitely have to do that. So I can't really help you. I'm not comfortable teaching you or telling you how to punctuate dialogue when I can't even do it myself very well. I mean, I can if I really sit there and think about it, but when I'm writing, I don't worry about it. I'll fix that later, you know, because I know that that's one of my Achilles heels of my own writing. All right, next, the editor said, I would say telling instead of showing. And she said, this is kind of a hot topic, so I'm reading it verbatim. So I'd like to make it clear that it's not always appropriate to show instead of tell, but no reader wants to constantly read. He was excited. She felt sad. Her mom was angry. That leads to a boring read and dull characters. That's what she said. So you can, there is times to tell and there's times to show, and you kind of got to know which is which. If you're doing too many of one thing, another, that's one thing that I have to, when I get to the filter words in a moment, it's one thing I have to remember about filter words. When we talk about filter words, that means words you filter out of your manuscript that you're using too much, or you might have a word that you personally use too much, like frown or laugh or something, and you go through your manuscript and you do your find and replace, and you have like a million laughs or something, and you're like, wow, I got to fix some of those. It doesn't mean you have to get rid of every single one of them and eliminate them from your manuscript. It just means you should use them, occasionally. You should cut down on them. One of the mistakes that I see made is like, don't use was and were, so everybody cuts out every bit of was. Well, sometimes you need was for it to make sense. So, yeah, when we say filter words, you need to get rid of filter words. We're not saying eliminate them all. All right? Third thing she said was, let's see, adjective phrases have hyphens before the noun, but not after. Adjectives, modified, nouns, and pronouns. Adjective phrases are phrases that modify a noun, like describe. They're descriptive word. Descriptive phrases, okay? So a lot of times with the descriptive phrase, you'll put a little hyphen. She says don't put hyphen after the noun. All right, some compound words, compound nouns are like toothbrush. You have tooth and brush, or cupcake, cup and cake. So she said, oftentimes, some of those compound words are closed, like the word oftentimes is one word, head first is one word, midway is one word, but some are open, like never mind is two words, a lot is two words, all right is two words. And I can tell you another one, water bottle is two words, but it's a compound noun. So she says be careful with those. And she said some always have hyphens, some of these words, like the example she gives is well-being, face first, off limits. She said those always have hyphens in them. That kind of thing you might not know, so you might, leave that up to the editor. I guess she'd probably hate me saying that, but that's something that I think only the editor would probably know for sure, unless you look all those up. Sometimes on your word processors will catch that for you and want you to put a hyphen. Every time it wants me to put a hyphen, I just put it in there. So because I'm like, well, Microsoft Word says to put a hyphen, so I did. I've never had my editor come back and gripe at me for that, but I think that's something that an editor would probably know better than we do. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe you know those. Maybe you know all the compound nouns really well. I don't know. All right. Lastly, she said, I fix consistency issues way more than you'd think, especially if it's fantasy. Intentionally decide, okay, this is a big thing, and this is another fantasy author that I talked to actually mentioned as well. When you have new monsters, like I have a monster called a Drosmidul, or you have place names, or you have characters, or your characters like to refer to somebody as your majesty, and they capitalize your majesty, not following the real rules of the real world or something. You should do that throughout your novel, because what she's saying is sometimes when you have these made-up names, in science fiction as well, you have these made-up names, you'll capitalize them sometimes and then not capitalize them other times. And it gets confusing to the editor because they have no idea about your novel. They don't know if that's supposed to be capitalized or not. So when you start capitalizing some and don't capitalize others, and it's the same word, they have to get back in contact with you and say, now, wait a minute, is this supposed to be capitalized or not? Because they don't know. So if you start capitalizing something when you're doing your editing phase, make sure that all those are capitalized. Or if you're not going to capitalize it, don't capitalize any of them. Make sure that they're all the same. Be consistent. She said, I fix consistency issues way more than you think, especially if it's fantasy. Intentionally decide which landmarks, buildings, events, creatures, etc. are proper nouns and should be capitalized, and make sure it's consistent. And of course, spelled consistently. That's another thing she said. She says they'll spell it one way one time and they'll spell it a completely different way another time. And she'll be like, okay, which way is the right spelling? Because it's made up word. All right. She said, I would make a style sheet in addition to character sheet to keep track of these types of choices. So if you make these choices and you keep track of them, she recommends you make your own style sheet so that you can give that style sheet to the editor when you get it, if you are going to use an editor. You give that style sheet to the editor so that they'll know what to look for. You personally, since it's your manuscript, if you're not going to use an editor, you probably already know, but still keep all that stuff consistent. You can make your own style sheet for yourself because you might forget things. All right. So also spellings that the person struggles with remembering, like the ones I mentioned in the last comment. Okay, I get it. Then she said, okay. I also asked this editor, I said, to the best of the ability, okay. I also asked if the author should self-edit to the best of their ability before sending the manuscript to the pro editor. Now, this might seem like kind of a duh statement, but her answer was that would help a lot. She said it would not only mean they get their book back from the editor quicker, but it would also minimize the chance of the editor missing something, and it could save them money if the editor charges by the hour, especially, or if they can avoid having to pay for multiple rounds of editing. All right, so here's one thing that she didn't say that I've come across in my own writing. When you send stuff to an editor, you should send stuff to the editor if you're going to use a professional editor last, meaning you should self-edit, like I just talked about. You should send it to your beta readers and get all their feedback and make all their changes that you want to make. Then you send it to the editor finally, because the editors are not cheap. If you used a professional editor, you know that they're not cheap. And when you get it back from that professional editor, that should be your last correction, your last round of corrections. If you get that back and then you make a bunch more corrections, guess what? You just basically wasted your money, because the editor's gonna be mad because you just used all their edits and then you made new ones that they haven't checked, and so you're gonna put their name that they edited your book, and they didn't change all the edits because you changed stuff after you got it back. That tends to make them mad, right? So they should be the last person you send it to. If you're self-editing, your last thing that you should do is have it read back to you by the computer. And when I say by the computer, or you can have it read back to you by a person if someone's willing to do that for you. I know it's going to be tedious and boring, and it's a metallic voice, but it's absolutely essential, because that's where you're going to catch the rest of your mistakes. That's where you're going to catch. You might not catch the punctuation errors and things like that, but you'll definitely catch misspellings. You'll catch typos, and you'll hear if there's an awkward sentence when it's read back to you by the computer. If there's an awkward sentence, man, it's going to stand out big time. You're going to hear that and you go, wow, oh, that's clunky. Yeah. And you're going to be able to fix it that way. All right. So that is my presentation on self-editing. I think I covered everything. I hope I did. So I'm going to look at the chat now. I've got a little bit of a delay here. It was kind of throwing me off earlier. So if you have any questions, now would be the time. Let's see. Wow. We're going way back. All right, I'm trying to see if there's any questions here. Hopefully, if you had a question, you put a Q in it so I can. Okay. But anyway. Oh, here's Carrie. You're an editor as well as an author, so you probably understand a lot of those things I was talking about with the. You spend all the time editing, you send it back, and then the author makes a bunch of changes beyond your edits. And then it's like, oh, I didn't see those last round of edits because you changed a bunch of stuff and didn't tell me. All right, let's see. So far, I guess there's not a lot of questions. I guess you understand that. Do any of you have trouble with things like commas? I put that in there because that tends to be the one that I see the most when I'm grading. Here's one. Any advice on developmental edits? Okay. Yeah, developmental edits. Um, Again, that's one of those things where you might need a beta reader. The beta reader would help you on those developmental edits, because when you send it to a beta reader, even just one, if there's any inconsistency or any kind of plot hole or issue like that, they're going to catch it, and they're going to be like, "Hey, at the beginning of the book, you said this." Because one of the things about writing a novel is you spend months writing this novel, and you give it to a reader, and they read it in a few days. So stuff you hadn't seen unless you go back and reread your novel every time you start writing something in it, you haven't seen like the first part of it in like 3 or 4, 5, 6 weeks or even months. And then the reader they saw it yesterday, that part yesterday. So they'll look at it and they'll think, oh, you said in this part that they were going west, and then over here now they're heading east somehow. They'll tell you. So that's one thing on developmental. Or they'll see a plot hole, or you'll say, hey, you said this person had long hair, now they have short hair, or something along those lines. Usually the beta reader will catch those developmental stuff. And you can ask them in more, you can ask them for more information a lot of times too, and they're usually beta readers are really happy to talk about your whatever you want to talk about. But that would be my advice about developmental. Other than that, if you don't have any beta readers, well, usually you do that before you send to an editor. But if you send it to an editor, the editor, the first thing they're going to do a lot of times is look for developmental stuff, or they'll mention it to you. Sometimes it depends on what kind of editor you use. The editor I use, she'll definitely tell me if she comes across something that's weird, that needs to be developed better, or doesn't make sense in the story or something. All right, let's see. What is your recommendation for the majority of authors majority of self-authors to self-edit or to hire the editing process out? Okay, if you have the money, hire it out. If you don't have the money, or if you just are very confident in your own skills, then self-edit. There's nothing wrong with self-editing, by the way. There's a stigma around the self-publishing community that thinks that maybe if your book is self-edited, that it's going to be somehow bad. I have degrees in English, and I still use an editor. But if I have to, and my editor's not available, I do self-edit, and I do self-edit large parts of it. And I self-edit before I send it, because it's embarrassing to have 2 degrees in English and send something to my editor that's all, ridiculously bad grammar-wise, especially when I've written 3 grammar books, 4 grammar books. I really, I make sure I edit I probably make my manuscript just about perfect before I send it to an editor, and I still send it to an editor. But you do not have to. If you're confident with your skills and you can self-edit, you can self-edit. It's fine. A lot of times, like I said, the self-editing is sometimes it's a necessity. Sometimes people can't afford, especially if you're just starting out and you're writing a book, you can't really afford to get an editor, because sometimes they're really expensive. I know a couple of cheaper ones, yeah. So if you're confident, or if you're not confident in self-editing, but you don't really want to use an editor, there's resources out there. I mean, there's a ton of grammar books. You can follow what I said, and you can self-edit just fine. There's nothing wrong with self-editing, which sounds like blasphemy to some people. You don't have to use an editor, but my suggestion is, if you can afford it, use the editor no matter what, because there's going to be things that you might not catch. I mean, if you listen to everything back, like I told you, and actually put a lot of effort into it, you're probably going to get a pretty clean manuscript anyway, but it doesn't hurt. Like I said in the last part of the presentation, when you do self-edit, you get pretty close to that and you send it to an editor, you're going to get it back a lot faster than if you just, this editor I've talked to, sometimes it's obvious that people have sent their rough draft to her, and she's supposed to go through and fix the rough draft, and it takes her forever because there's so much to do. But if you've already self-edited, even to a small extent, and you send it to an editor, you're going to get it back a lot faster, and you're going to pay a lot less money, especially if they're doing it by hour. If they're doing it by a rate by hour. Rate by word is not so different, because it doesn't really matter if they give you a rate by word. But if they're doing an edit by their hour, then yeah, by time, it's going to take them a lot more time to get through a rough draft than it will a self-edited manuscript. All right. Any more questions? Let's see. The self-edit at the end after copy editing is what always makes me the most. Yeah. The stuff at the end after copy editing. Yes. Yeah. Does that make you nervous as a writer or as an editor? Oh, yeah. You're welcome, Andy. Great. Do you have a rule of thumb for how much time to spend on the different stages of self-editing? Yes. My personal time frame is, like I said, go through the manuscript and fix the big things the small things first. Go through the things that you can do really well and easily, and don't spend more than a certain amount of time per chapter. I would say probably, depending on how fast you read and how fast you edit, I would say no more than a day or so per chapter. And then, that depends. That depends a lot on the speed that you read and that you can edit. Me personally, I do like 2 or 3 chapters a day, and then I move on. What I don't do is if I find something I have to spend a lot of time looking up or researching or something, like I don't know a grammar rule or something, and I have to go and look it up, or I have to find something about it, I flag that with I highlight it or whatever, and I move on, because I know it's going to take time, and I want to get done with the easy part of it first, and I'll go back and fix that later. So you always want to feel like you're progressing. If you feel like you're bogging down on anything, that will usually feel like you're bogging down, and that's what happens when people stop working on their books. They bog down, they get tired of it, and they'd rather watch Netflix or something. So always feel like you're progressing. All right. Oh, good. I'm glad I explained things well. Thank you. Makes me nervous as a writer. Oh, as a writer, after my copy editor sent back the manuscript and recommendations. Yeah. To expand scenes. Yeah. Okay. So one thing I will say about that I get from students a lot is when you say you need more character development. I'm like, well, what's more character development? Well, more character development is more information about the character. That's all it is. So your character, the information that we have about this character is thin, is what we're saying. So when you get feedback and it says, I wish there was a little bit more character development, what they're saying is, I want more information, or I want more about your character. So add more about the character. That's character development. All right. Let's see. What are your recommendations for self-editing a series? Oh my gosh. One step at a time. Start with the first one. Start, like I said, chapter by chapter, and go through it. I would keep, and I do this. I don't have it with me here, but I keep a notebook of paragraphs of what each chapter is about when I'm doing the series. And I have it for each book, and that way I know what's in each chapter. That way, when you're talking about chapters over many books, I can go back and I can look at what happened. It's like, oh, I forgot what I put in that first book. I can go back and I can look at that chapter, and I can see, and I can even go back on my main manuscript and look at the whole chapter if I need to. But that way I can go back. I can refer to other chapters in other books. I keep it in a little printout notebook of paragraphs of what happens in each chapter. And that's how I edit my series. Because if you don't do something like that, and you have like a 5, 6, 7, 8, 12 book series, you're going to forget stuff. It's just going to happen. There's going to be things that you're going to, you don't want to have it published and then go back and say, oh, that was completely wrong. And even your beta readers will forget things if you're not careful. So you have to be careful with that. So yeah, I keep notes on the old other books. Okay, opinion on self-editing on a physical copy or on the computer. Okay, so This is a big one. You're going to do better on physical copies just because there is the blue screen and a little bit of screen fatigue when you're looking at a screen. If you have glasses that have the blue filter, that will help. But it depends on how much you're editing at a time. If you do a little at a time, like I suggest, then you're probably going to be okay with the screens. But if you end up doing, like the question before, the big long series, and you're doing a lot, printing it out it might cost a lot to print it out, even in paragraphs. So, if you have a 250 word novel and you print that out, it's gonna be a lot of ink and paper. So sometimes you just have to do it on the screen. But if I had my druthers, I would probably print it all out. But depends on how long your book is and whether or not that's feasible or not. That might not be feasible depending on. With me, with fantasy, it's just not feasible to print them all out because that would cost a mint in paper and ink. So I just do it on screen. But there are advantages to doing on screen. You can take notes and stuff on screen as well. I'm happy to add what the editor is asking for, but then there's words that they haven't edited. Okay, yeah. One thing I've noticed about editors, professional editors, because I write fantasy, right? And this probably works with science fiction as well, is they don't know your book like you do, and they don't know certain things. So sometimes I'll get feedback from them, and it's like, okay, that has nothing to do with any character, or that has nothing to do with it, or that's completely wrong. I don't know how they got that information. Okay, there's two things that tells me. Number one, that tells me that I haven't been clear enough in my writing, and I need to go back and fix some stuff. And two, it tells me that, okay, well, that person doesn't really understand that. So maybe I should ignore that piece of advice or something that they gave back to me because they didn't understand what the character was about or something. But usually that clues me in that maybe I should be a little bit more clear with what that character is doing, because obviously there's somebody who's reading it that didn't understand it. But a lot of times you'll catch that in beta reading. If you have a beta reader, you'll catch something like that. Getting it almost done and ordering a proof copy from KDP has worked for me. Oh, I see. In the past, rather than printing it out at home. Yes, that is a good idea. Thank you for that. Yeah, you can order one in usually for a couple bucks. That's a lot cheaper than printing them out, and then you can use a physical copy like in a book. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, you can do that as well. That would, if you're wanting to do it that way, then yeah. If you're wanting to have a physical copy, then yeah, order one in. I forgot about that being an option. Sorry. But yeah, I just don't do it. That's why I didn't remember it. Okay. Ask for a refund or spotting for the oversight. Oh. Yeah, I've done a proofread on copy. I printed. Yeah, there you go. I printed on my home computer, and I thought I caught everything, but there's something about reading the proof that, yeah, it's those last issues. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, I don't do that. I always do it on screen, but I didn't even think about that. I could probably, I have some books that I ordered in. I probably could write in them. Everything I order in, since I paid money for it, I just kind of don't touch it. I don't know why, but that's just me. I probably should go through and mark it that way. But yeah, if you read from your book and you're reading it yourself, seeing it in print, any kind of typo that you might have missed, even with listening back, which is unlikely, but it's possible, you're going to see it. Oh, yeah, you can. I'd be glad to interview on a podcast. That'd be cool. Yeah, actually, I think I've actually featured some of your books in my newsletter, Merrick. I remember a couple of your books. But, all right. Somebody have any other questions or anything before we go? Yeah, just get with me, Merrick. I think my email, if it's not in the description, it's clevebourbon@clevebourbon.com. It's really easy. Let's see. Oh, yeah, and then there's the giveaways, and also there's links down in the description of this video that takes you to the Authortube writing conference and all the giveaways and all that stuff. So don't forget to visit those. Okay, Thank you guys. I'm going to be in the happy hour, so I will be in there as well. So okay, thanks guys. Appreciate it. Have a good night, and I'll see you in writing. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.